Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel will focus on the question of how the war will reshape our world. Let me introduce the moderator, Sándor Gallai, head of the School of Social Sciences and History at MCC.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. To start from the left of yours, there is Dr. Caroline Galacteros, who is a French geopolitician, speaker and columnist for various French and international media, a former civil servant, professor, the founder and chairwoman of GEOPARMA, a think tank and also an action tank. And also she is the head of Planet Inc., an advisory firm of strategic intelligence. Next to her, you can see Dr. Mohammed Ahmed Gain, who is university professor in Morocco, the president of the African Institute for Peace Building and Conflict Transformation, and also a non-resident expert at the Middle East Institute of Washington. We have here in the middle Mr. Will Roger, who is the president of the American Institute of Economic Research, and Afghanistan war veteran, and who also serves as a member of the Fulbright Foreign Scholarship Board at the US State Department, appointed by former President Donald Trump. Next to me, you can see Mr. Michael van der Schulenberg, who is a former Associate Secretary General, who worked in various capacities for the UN, and also for 4 years at the OSCE. In many countries he served, and these were countries in wars and countries with interstate armed conflicts or affected by wars, including Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and Sierra Leone. Apology for a very difficult question to begin with. The question relates to the war. We will talk about the post-war situation, but first I'd like to clarify, how do you see the war ending? What is your perception? How can the war end? Can we start with you, Madam?
Okay, it works. So, yeah, it's a very, very complicated question. As some of the previous speakers said, I think that we're not close to an end of this conflict, even in its military phase, because contrary to Mr. Ashur just said, I think that the balance of force is for the moment and probably in the future on the Russian side. So for Ukraine, it's a very, very complicated future, and it has been almost completely destroyed, military speaking. And of course, even if the NATO wants to help, perhaps for a last turn, Ukraine to strike and to try a counteroffensive, I'm not very optimistic concerning the results of that move, which has just begun finally. So how and when will it end? It will end, as Mr. Sachs stressed, when we will remember that we had once upon a time European security based on indivisibility, interdependence, based on the principle that no country or no group of countries could extend its security on the expenses of the other. This principle has been completely forgotten and destroyed. And that's probably something very important to be restored if we want to speak seriously about peace. Secondly, of course, in my opinion, peace for Ukraine, or for what is left of Ukraine, because Ukraine is, of course, a proxy, but also Ukrainian people is certainly the principal victim of this stupid war. Peace is neutrality. Peace means, like Mr. Sachs stressed again, it means NATO recognition that It doesn't need to expand. And that's also the limit of the comparison with Munich, because it was Germany who wanted to expand, okay? So in that case, as we said in France, comparison is not reason. So yeah, that's exactly the contrary. The NATO, the alliance wants and expanded towards Russia, towards its borders, and now we are surprised that finally, after so many warnings, they had to react. It's very, if you take a map, it's so obvious. So we need to cut with the hypocrisy, and we need to understand that if we want to save Ukraine and European security, we have to admit that Ukraine will be protected by its neutrality, which was the case. Neutrality is a virtue. Neutrality is not something wrong. It depends on your position on the map. And in the Ukrainian case, I think it's obvious.
So you expect a neutral Ukraine and the neutrality of the country protected by the great powers, the Western powers, and Russia?
Yes, of course, by everybody. Cross guarantees.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Gain, what is your future vision of Ukraine?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank the MCC for giving me the opportunity to come to Budapest for the second time and to be among you today here in this wonderful gathering of experts with their different backgrounds. I think that the previous panel has paved the way for the discussion, and I have here in front of me one of the remarks made by Mr. Mahboubani. World powers are really stuck in the past. And with these memories of violence, these memories trigger present conflicts, not just in Europe, but also elsewhere, in Africa too. I have this question: don't we really need today a transition from what I would call violent remembrance to peaceful forgetting, and embrace this idea of a peaceful multipolar world? Unfortunately, violent remembrance, this is what the war in Ukraine is about, because I do believe that the war in Ukraine is about, or conjures up really images from the past, reminiscence of the Cold War times, although each conflict has its own unique character and tries to defy in a way or another history, but a clear-cut defeat in the war seems to be really unlikely for many reasons, because there is this concern among security analysts that we are in front probably of a protracted or intractable fight or a potential frozen conflict for many reasons. And one of these reasons, because the war in Ukraine has these international dimensions. In peace building and peacemaking, one of the factors that can exacerbate a conflict situation is when you have more participants in this conflict, sometimes through proxies. And in this case, we have the US. The US, with the absence, as Mr. Sachs has put it, with the absence of voices from within Europe to really revisit the approach, to consider alternative policy choices with regard to this growing violent antagonism and competition. So, two important factors to practically end any open conflict, and getting, of course, these warring parties to the conflicts to talk. The first one is when one of these parties becomes really unable to sustain, the war. And the second, when there is an outside pressure to put this pressure on the parties to explore pathways to peace, to negotiate. Instead of carrying on hostilities. But this is unfortunately, this is not the case for the war in Ukraine, especially with what I mentioned before, this growing polarization between the global West and its rivals. We have Russia, a major nuclear power and an energy exporter, who is violating the international legality, the sovereignty of a member state to the United Nations, and Russia can sustain the war, can sustain the conflicts for years to come, because it is a homegrown war machine, because of its enormous reserves of manpower and resources, while Western powers are there as participants to this conflict situation through a proxy or instrumentalizing these memories from the past to really, as I said, set a tone to this violent confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. So I'm not sure that the NATO will engage in any unprovoked action against Russia, but this power will not be also satisfied if Ukraine crosses a kind of threshold that could spark an escalation unacceptable in a way or another to the West, but it stays as a simplistic understanding to see Ukraine as a mere proxy. This denies the Ukrainians their agency, and you know, as I said, because this reminds us of Cold War era. The Cold War era for Ukraine connotes something different from what it does for the Russians. It is about losses and gains. A country that gains its independence, but a Soviet Union that lost its really value and power at the international level.
Mr. Raja, you have personal direct experience from Afghanistan. Mr. Sachs mentioned Ukraine can become the next country similar to Afghanistan. What is your take on that? What can stop the war? Will Ukraine become Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I think that we should have a lot of intellectual humility about knowing how this will end. You know, history doesn't give us a lot of confidence that we know how things are going to evolve here, and you know, I think that we should take that to heart. You know, that being said, I think it's really important for us to recognize that as long as one of the actors believes that they can achieve their war aims on the battlefield better than at the diplomatic table, that we're going to continue to see fighting. And I'm fairly pessimistic that won't be the case. So I think that the war will continue for some time, and we should reconcile ourselves to that. And then speaking as an American and thinking about American national interests as well as the interests of our allies and partners, I think we have to really question whether it's in America's interests and those partners to continue to fund the conflict to the extent to which we have over the last year. I mean, the Treasury, the taxpayers' dollars should not be, I think, a kind of open vault to continue a conflict that frankly doesn't implicate American national interests very heavily, except to the extent to which we want to avoid an escalation that could lead to a nuclear conflict. And so I'm greatly worried about escalatory spirals. I think we heard that in previous panels, and I think we should take that quite seriously. Now, as long as the United States and others are helping to foot the bill for this conflict, I think that we should have a seat at the table about what we're willing to give up to try to end this war and to find a path forward to peace. And I think the United States should take the lead in closing the NATO's open door, because while it isn't the only reason for the war, it certainly is an important aspect of the causal story that leads us to last year's beginning of the conflict. And I think that this would be a major, important step to take. It's also not just something that ends the war, but it actually supports our interests. I mean, The expansion of NATO to include, or the idea of the expansion of NATO to include countries like Ukraine and Georgia was not wise in the first place. And so the idea that we would be giving something up by this in the United States is a mistake. We aren't giving something up that isn't actually supportive of our interests. So again, when people say we shouldn't trade our things that we think are valuable to the Russians for their act of aggression, I don't think this is necessarily valuable. It's certainly valuable to Ukraine. And the other thing is that, yes, if Ukraine wants to continue to fight, look, more power to it. I think we can recognize their bravery and their desire to maintain their sovereignty in the face of Russia's aggression. I think we can appreciate that. But that doesn't mean that we have to go along with a blank check approach, nor have maximalist war aims in the United States and in the West or go along with Ukraine's maximalist war aims. I think there's moral dignity in following the national interest, and we need to follow ours to the hilt. So do our European partners, so does Hungary. And that means that we can't necessarily just impose Ukraine's interests for our own. That's an utter mistake, I think. And again, so I think we should be willing, especially given our desire to avoid an escalatory spiral, we should be willing to seek a much reduced peace than what the Ukrainians currently are, because we've created moral hazard.
Mr. Schulenburg, what can bring ceasefire, what can bring peace to Ukraine?
Oh, it's on now. I don't have to do anything. That's great. No, thank you very much. Now, let me say, all I'm saying here is, of course, what William says is speculation. I compared it to many other wars which I've seen and things like this one. I don't see any peace in the Ukrainian-Russian war at all likely for the foreseeable future. I think it's probably more likely that we might have a ceasefire by the end of the year. I don't think it might be a negotiated ceasefire. It will be just a de facto ceasefire that these countries reduce their fighting and sort of establish on a certain ceasefire line. At the same time, we have to say that the ceasefire will be extremely unstable. It is 1,300 kilometers. There will be no monitors between them. I can't see UN peacekeepers going in between. That has something to do with a peacekeeper mentality that over such a long thing, and I don't think there are really countries who would be prepared to provide peacekeepers for moving between Russia and the Ukraine on the other side. The reason why peace is so difficult is actually something very simple I felt in many of these negotiations that both sides cannot agree on what this war was about or is about. What is the central problem? And why they don't agree is that each side develops their own narrative in the war, which always shows the other one as a bad guy and themselves as a good guy. He is the aggressor, I am the victim, and so on. And this, of course, doesn't allow really to focus on what this conflict is for. So I think very often to have peace negotiations, you have actually the politicians which were there for the time in which this war broke out and which supported it and provided military assistance and so on, we will not see a Biden sort of change his mind. But there are interesting things, and that is, of course, the forthcoming US elections, presidential elections. We know that former President Trump has said he will end this, what do you say, 24 or 48 hours?
I'm sure it'll be quicker.
Quicker. You see, even his Republican challenger said it's not, DeSantis said it's not in the American interest, in what you also said. America has by far now a more sophisticated debate about this war than we find it, for instance, in Europe. Here we have Hungary, maybe Turkey, if we say that's European countries, but otherwise Europe is completely sold out on an ideology of a war narrative on which they cannot move. And so Europe will not play any role in the peace in Ukraine, unfortunately, although it's a war on European soil where Europe should take the lead. Europe should be interested in peace negotiations, but Europe doesn't have a peace plan. That's the thing. China has one, but we don't have one. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, it's our own neighborhood. We don't even have a plan for a ceasefire because the European Union as such says that they stick to Zelensky's peace plan, which doesn't foresee any negotiations until Russia withdraws from all areas, including the Crimean Peninsula, something which is completely unrealistic. So we pursue a policy in Europe is unrealistic. So if we have a change, it will come from the United States. And if we have there a different president who is not burdened by the narrative which was developed before, it could change everything. It could also change everything for the Ukraine. But let me say also something about the Ukraine itself. It always sounds as if I'm against the Ukraine, but we should not forget, the Ukraine has lost this war already. It is a completely destroyed country. Also, all the weapons we sent them are, except some of the drones, they are also exploding on Ukrainian territory. The British depleted uranium ammunitions will be in Ukrainian soil for a long times to come. It is a country which is deeply divided inside. I think the myth of a Ukraine which sort of sticks together is not there. The country is deeply divided, which will make a peace deal extremely difficult for the future. The Ukraine is a country which depopulates itself continuously. I think they have now lost about 20 million people since they became independent in '91, and the war has accelerated this whole thing. It is a country which is politically fragmented. The moment we have a ceasefire, there will be haymaker in the government. And who accepts it? And I know that from the Iran-Iraq war that this almost led a ceasefire to a civil war, and I think that might be a very, very similar situation. I want also to say that, you know, the Ukraine was already, with Moldova, the poorest country before the war in Europe. What it must be today, I mean, we don't say much about these things, it must be a terribly impoverished country with virtually no economy anymore. And we should also not forget, it was always one of the most corrupt countries in Europe. And I don't think, by all the nice talk Zelensky does, that during a wartime you can stop corruption. Corruption increases because everybody has a family outside and they need some money to support them living in Germany and buying a house like we have in things like this one. So I think that this is a problem. We might have a peace for a country which we say we supported, which basically has ceased to exist to a certain degree.
Thank you. Let's see how you envisage the post-war situation. Let me start with Mr. Roger from an American perspective. What is the role of the US in the post-war geopolitical world order?
Yeah, I mean, I've said for a long time, again, and I repeated it today, that American national interests, our vital ones, are not really implicated by this conflict. So it would be strange for me to argue now that somehow this war would fundamentally change the dynamics of American national power. Now, I do worry that if we continue to send a blank check, that we will further undermine our economic power, which is the seedbed of our military power. But look, we're a rich country. We can spend a lot of money, as we witnessed in Afghanistan and Iraq, where we spent trillions of dollars for a project that didn't lead very far and actually undermined our country's interests in so many ways. But I would say that the world is such that I think it's shown itself to be a place in which Russia is not what many people who are primacists in the American context, both left and right, is not a kind of great power competitor in the same way that you imagine the kind of great powers of the 19th century or of the bipolar struggle, right? Russia, its economy is a kind of middle-tier European country in terms of its overall material wealth. Its military has shown itself to be effective in some ways, particularly with the use of artillery, but ineffective in other ways. It's been bogged down against a country like Ukraine, which again, admittedly, is brave, but is not a near-peer competitor by any means, and yet it's been bogged down by its logistical challenges, its strategic and tactical poor performance. And so it's shown itself that the United States in Europe really does not have a great power threat. The biggest challenge for the United States, of course, globally is China. And instead of trying to, I think, listen to kind of realist logic that the United States showed during the Cold War of trying to make sure that Russia and China did not come together to dominate a big part of Eurasia, we've actually pushed them closer together, and I think that's a vast mistake. I'm not sure how easy it would be to fully separate them, but pushing them together has been a massive error. But the United States still stands as the most important power on the planet. Its military power, its economic power is unrivaled. We have to remember that, and that means that we should continue to think about international relations. Maybe we wouldn't use the term unipolar moment in quite the same way, because the imbalance is less than it was clearly today than it was in 1991. But the United States is still a dominant power with only one country that's even close, and that's China. And so I think that we'll likely see more of the same, which is a real challenge, unless the United States can I think, improve on its grand strategy. And that's why I think that if we continue to follow a primacist view, it may not happen. It's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen in 3 or 5 years, likely. Again, unless we get into a really significant escalatory spiral here. But as long as we continue to pursue primacy, we are undermining our long-run national power. Realism and restraint about how we approach the world is the way to lengthen America's dominance in the international system. And that is good for the United States, and it will be good for much of the world, including Europe, which I think could then pursue greater strategic autonomy in a way that would be beneficial for itself, especially at this moment when it can pursue that, given that Russia has shown itself not to be as great a danger as we oftentimes think. And so I think that this is a time in which our grand strategies, both in the United States and in the countries of Europe, can shift in a way that's profitable towards both, and that's where the international system should go.
Do you expect NATO, Russia, and US-Russia relations in the post-war situation to ease or to further deteriorate?
Again, I think structural variables matter a lot in international politics, but elections also matter because elections will bring to power people with different ideas that do affect how they see the world, the assumptions that they bring to bear, like whether they think it's not always 1938 or not, and also what type of strategy do they see best to promote American interests. And there I think that if you got someone who was at least restraint adjacent, someone like President Trump or others, that you might see an evolution in NATO that would be, I think, profitable in many ways, right? So some greater burden sharing, some greater burden shifting. The United States could pay more attention to the strategic challenge of China. Europe could focus on what remains of the challenge to the European order from Russia, and let's not forget from the challenges that come from the South, particularly in the case of refugees and immigration challenges. And I think, again, acknowledging the fact that even friends and allies have different interests and therefore are going to sometimes disagree is not a problem. We don't have to assume a harmony of interests to have cooperation. And so I think a much more realistic approach where we look at the national interest and we engage with each other in a way to adjudicate difference in a cooperative way, recognizing those interests, is a better way forward for peace. And if we did that in relation to Russia, I think we'd be in a better position today.
Dr. Galacteros, how do you see the future of the European Union and its member states, more particularly France, in the post-war situation?
I think that European community, European Union has a big problem concerning sovereignty. And of course, it comes to the French perspective on European sovereignty. In France, I can say that, in my opinion, our leadership is deliberately confusing national sovereignty and European sovereignty. So it's a trap. It's an illusion. It's a fantasy completely. And it's a trap in the end for France and certainly for Europe, because Europe needs to be stronger. And certainly we were speaking about decoupling Russia from European Union, which was the goal of the American, certainly of the States. I would have hoped, I would have liked to see the decoupling of Europe from the States. And certainly the next step in decoupling, the next thing we should like to see is decoupling Russia from China now, because we have accelerated not the alliance, but the links between the two. So for Europe, Europe is in a trap. Europe is a second proxy of the States in Ukraine, second rank, if I may say. So we are directly involved. Who can deny that? Seriously. We are directly involved. We are neighbors to Russia still. We were dependent on Russian gas, certainly, but now we are dependent on American gas, which is 4 times more expensive. So I'm not sure it's a good deal. I'm not sure it's a good deal. And so the future for Europe, if I can make a dream, is the ability to think by itself, to start to assess its own interests in Eurasia, because we are part of Eurasia as European Union. But we completely forget that dimension. So we are so aligned. It doesn't mean being cut from the States or being not allied anymore with the States. But alignment is not just submission. It's not just slavery, just obeying to what is ordered, because we have our own interests, in my opinion, and certainly our own interests. And for France, it's non-alignment. Is stop renouncing to ourselves. Because when I heard William Ruger, sorry, yes, you're speaking about national interests, and I think it's natural, it's normal, we should do the same. We should do the same, but we have lost the habit.
And it avoids the kind of ideological thinking that is its opposite.
Exactly.
But
we need not to be dogmatic anymore.
Can I interpret your words as supporting President Macron's efforts? When he came back from China, he was speaking out of order. The same stands for NATO opening in Japan a new office. President Macron again said, no, it's not a wise decision. Is it a kind of trying to find this very narrow pathway, or is it the first sign of going against US interests?
I cannot speak for my president, but as a free spirit, I could, an observer, I could say that probably our president has very good intuitive thoughts and even sometimes will of doing something, or of decoupling a little bit France from this completely insane move towards war and escalation. But, and it's also concerns China, certainly, but when he returns, suddenly, after 2 days, he just abandons what he said. So it's very complicated to know, to weigh the sincerity and the deepness of his thought. Sorry.
Mr. Schulenburg, how do you see the future of the European Union, and do you have an assessment of the German perspectives?
I don't live in Germany. I don't know necessarily. I see the European Union in a way is in an extremely difficult position out of which I can't see it coming out of. You know, the attitude Europe takes towards the conflict in the Ukraine is an irrational attitude. It is not an attitude whether it's national interest or European interest. They are not taking their interest in it. The European Union should have helped to prevent the war in the first place, and this war was preventable. There was a timid little effort between France and Germany in 2008 when they said we want to delay the Ukraine to become a member, but they gave it up afterwards. And so Europe basically didn't do anything to avoid a conflict which was 30 years in the making. I mean, there was no secret that we were going to go to some kind of war with Russia. And we were stuck on that one. How can we do this? I mean, we have now a policy where I think Europe escalates the war more than the United States. Actually, I see in the United States rather sort of pulling back. We are sending now the tanks. We are sending now the F-16s with the British. We are sending now a long-range missile of 250 kilometers, which they could go into Russia. We're sending depleted Iranian ammunition and things like this one. So we actually escalate the war. Not the Americans anymore. That's the interesting things. You know, America was opposed to the invasion of Russian, you know, with these Russian mercenaries and maybe even Polish with them. In Europe, not. British supported it. Even the German foreign minister say they have a right to do that. So maybe they have a right, but it is an escalation. And so I see no chance that Europe could come out of this one because the old engine we had, like France and Germany, is not together anymore. It's actually not together at all anymore. They hardly talk to each other. They can just meet when they talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a sort of conflict nobody knows quite where it is. But the real conflict, the real issues for Europe, we don't know. And you know what Europe has achieved after the end of the Cold War is that we have both sides. We didn't have only the Atlantic. We could also go into Asia. And now we voluntarily cut us off from this one. I mean, in Germany, to now decouple from China, I mean, they are the greatest buyer of our Mercedes and BMWs and things like this one. Every 7 jobs in Germany depend on the car industry. I mean, the Chinese can build these cars themselves, especially electric cars. I mean, they don't need us. And I think I sometimes think it can't be true how irrational we are on this whole thing. So I see even that the European Union in itself might not stick together. We have now a leadership there with von der Leyen, and Borrell. I mean, they have no support in Europe. I mean, nobody would ever vote for them. Nobody knows even what they stand for. And so we have a European construct which becomes more and more military by sending weapons and things like this one, which has no solution. There is no solution for Europe. We will end up with a failed state, Ukraine, in our midst. It is a European fellow state. Ukrainians are fellow Europeans, and I tell you, that will cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. The United States will not pay with their next president, I'm pretty sure, but it will stand up on our doors. We will have to pay it, and I think that can blow the lid off the European integration, as sorry as I am about it, because I'm a very pro-European. Thank you.
In lack of a strong, effective European Union leadership, would you give more freedom to the member states then? What is your position on that?
You see, Europe has never decided whether they want to be a super state like the United States or a state association. I don't think with our tradition it will ever be a super state. And Mrs. von der Leyen thinks that wants to sit on the first chair when it goes to Turkey and things like that because she thinks she is the top on the whole thing. But I think only she tops us that she collects a lot of money, apparently, or her husband. No, there will be no super state European Union. And I think we have also to learn, it is a beauty that we are so different. I mean, why do we have all the same car number plates in the back? I can't understand it. I like that there's a French, and I like that there's an Hungarian, and I like even that there's a German sometimes. I would even like if there was a Bavarian, you know, where I come from originally. But, you know, we try to push something together where rules are made that nobody has any influence on, or nobody knows where they come from. And so I think that the European Union on the Ukrainian conflict has a real risk of disintegrating afterwards because there are a lot of other problems in the European Union which are completely unsolved. We are in trouble all. We are all in deep, deep trouble, and we don't even need a nuclear bomb for that one. And India and China will benefit, which I don't mind at all, because it's also their time.
Thank you. Mr. Gain, will Africa also benefit in any ways, or will it be a playground for great powers? What is your future vision of Africa?
Well, you know, as this panel tries to answer this question, how the war reshapes our world, when you look at the foreign policy choices of the European Union, this gives you the impression that the Europeans think that they are the world. And they ignore how this war in Ukraine has really geopolitical repercussions on the rest of the world. And allow me to bring this African perspective to this discussion. You see how Russia now is trying to gain ground in Africa, and this rise of competing interests between world powers, but looking at these new grounds only from this prism of competition, ignoring the local expectations to any form of partnership with the world beyond. Africa is, now we see Russia is putting to good use two big realities. For example, if we take the example of the Sahel, there is this real thirst for change. These traditional partners are apparently reluctant and unwilling to tackle the real, long-standing, chronic underdevelopment and governance issues. And they give priority to securitization policies. That's the first reality. Second reality is this, the coup d'etat we see, for example, in the Sahel. Military elites disrupting all juvenile, I would say, democratic practices in some countries, trying to introduce themselves as an alternative to the civilian political elites, and trying also to benefit from this antagonism and competition between Russia and the Europeans, and look for business with the Russians. For the Russians, in Africa is a new bargaining chip. And at the same time, Europeans seem not to be really inclusive in trying to shape partnership frameworks with the Africans. They introduce themselves as producers of peace, while Africans as peace subjects. So I do believe that Africans are fed up with these imported solutions from elsewhere. Yeah. Is Russia an alternative, a viable alternative? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. This pushes, I think that it's high time for the so-called traditional partners of Africa. France has to rethink its policy in the Sahel. France is losing ground now because of these missteps, because of this paternalistic, sometimes prescriptive attitude towards Africans. The war in Ukraine has adverse effects on Africa. I can give you 2 examples. With this disruption of the global supply chains, you know, these countries have witnessed incredible, very serious upsurge in prices. And these countries depend on Russia and Ukraine, their bread basket, to have food. The second one is that, and this has nothing to do with the Russians, it is about Europeans again, with these NATO priority commitments towards Ukraine, there is this fear among now these countries with the deep-seated insecurity and fragility and dependence on the humanitarian aid from international partners. There is this fear that Europeans will redirect and reroute their aids to Ukraine, and this may create a vacuum in Africa, which will be instrumentalized, used by the Russians again to gain more bargaining chips, not for the benefit for Africans, but for their own purely interest-oriented choices.
Thank you very much. For the remaining time, I'll take a couple of questions from the floor. The first one is, if the US benefits directly from this war, weapons sales, driving focus away from internal issues, etc., why would they end the war?
Yeah, if you don't mind me taking that. I think we have to disaggregate what we mean by the United States here, right? So we should make no doubt about it. The United States is not benefiting from this conflict. We're sending billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money overseas. There are members of the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower talked about that are benefiting, but that doesn't mean that the United States is benefiting. And it's not good for our economy to be spending monies on weapons of war that aren't necessary for our national interests because they're unproductive uses of our capital. We should be using that money. I ideally would want it in the private sector where I think it's used more efficiently. But even if it weren't, you'd want to use it on other priorities that are more productive. The weapons of war passed when you've met your interests and your security are not productive uses. Military Keynesianism is not a good theory. So yes, there are individuals. And I think that that's one of the reasons why our foreign policy is so misguided, is because there are powerful interests in Washington, some of them related to the military-industrial complex, some of them related to simply an ideational difference with realism, which says that the United States needs to be ideological and needs to be a global leader in the way that they've performed over the last 30 years. So again, there are these I think, cleavages in America that we need to understand, and not to approach it as, look, the United States benefits, therefore that's why the United States is in this. The United States is in this because the American foreign policy establishment is in favor of this type of approach to the world, and until we change that, we're going to be suffering in the rest of America, outside of the super zip codes of Washington, D.C. That's why I'm an advocate of realism and restraint, because I think it's good for our country.
Thank you very much. Another question is about neutrality, whether it would be a solution, an advantage at all, in the light of Russia's trustability. Can we trust Russia after the Budapest Memorandum, in other words?
I think it's more and more difficult to trust anybody. And certainly Russia has also a trust issues, a huge trust issues, because it has discovered, if it was not aware before, that it has completely been, comment est-ce qu'on dit, trahi, enfin, betrayed by the West, not only concerning the Minsk agreement. We had our former president and Mrs. Merkel, who just admitted that it was a fake, it was a setup. So 7 years lost. And of course, during the first panel, one speaker was speaking about the various comment est-ce qu'on dit, the various agreements or tentatives d'accord, attempts of agreement for peace. He has just forgotten one huge, last, probably, Russian attempt to achieve something and to avoid war. It was the Memorandum for European Security delivered by Russia to NATO, to Washington and to European Union, the 17th of December 2021. It was a big, big plan, which, if it had been considered, could have avoided probably war. nobody answered except NATO, who said, you worry for nothing. As somebody said, we are peace lovers, and the open door policy is our own policy and the only one. So it was just provocative action, in fact, this answer. So yeah, trust is a big issue. Trust is not there anymore between Russia and the States, between Russia and Europe, and of course between Russia and Ukraine. So yeah, we need time, and we need certainly some compromises. But if you see, recently, 2 days ago, President Putin just said, or Lavrov said, we want to, we can make a peace deal, we can speak, we can have a dialogue, but the Ukrainian leadership has set a law avoiding dialogue. It's forbidden by the Ukrainian constitution to speak with Russia. So it's just ridiculous. It's unrealistic.
I want to maybe add a maybe more hopeful note. The advantage, in guillemets, of this war is that it is a disaster for everybody. It's a disaster for Russia. It's a huge disaster for the Ukraine. It is a huge disaster for Europe, but I think it's also a disaster for the United States. I believe that we will come out of this one, that all will say, this war was unnecessary and it's not in our interest. In the end, it is not in Russia's interest. It's definitely not in Ukraine's interest. It's also not in Europeans' interest, and I would here agree with him, it's also not in the United States' interest. But for this one, we need a lot of time for new people to rise, to say, listen, what have we actually done here? And we are not so caught in our own narratives and ideologies where we think we defend the West, or we defend democracy, or we defend something good and bad and whatever. No, we have to take a step back, and then we have a chance for peace. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would like to be hopeful. I think that I do want to see a new elite rise, a counter-elite against the kind of international foreign policy coalition here. But remember, we're striking at the heart of what they believe that is both key to their intellectual system, but also treads on their more pecuniary interests. And I think that we need to be, we shouldn't be too sanguine. I think that means we have to be fighters, right? I think that people who want greater realism in any of our countries, we need to work together to promote this new or this old idea that is relevant for our new world, and to do it in a concerted way, which is one of the nice things about what MCC has done here. And I'm a patriotic American, and I think lots of great ideas come from America, and we don't always have to listen to what other people think, because a lot of bad ideas have been attempted to be exported into the United States from abroad. But I do think that we should be really quite happy that Hungary, for example, has taken the lead in trying to approach things differently and to offer new solutions. And I think that this is a case where Americans and other Europeans should listen, particularly given Hungary's particular place. And I've heard Hungarians like Balázs Orbán talk about, the kind of fear of nuclear escalation, especially given Hungary's political proximity to Ukraine. And I think that listening to that would be a good step forward here.
Mr. Schulenberg, a question to you. Did the OSCE do its job in Donbass between 2014 and 2022?
No, of course not. No, of course not. And I think this conflict is, in my view, the end of the OSCE. The OSCE, we should not forget, started after the end of the Cold War with the Charter of Paris. The Charter of Paris, in France, you shouldn't forget, that's exactly what you said, that security is indivisible, it's for all Europe, a common home. The word NATO is in the entire document not mentioned a single time. We have betrayed and I'm talking about the European because it's not for you, but because it was our agreement, we have betrayed ourselves by giving up on that one. So I think the OSCE today, I mean, I've worked there for 5 years, and that was in a time before the things. I thought about back in the Cold War. I mean, everybody banged down on Russia and Belarus and whatever. It was a language there also, which was nothing compared of what this Paris Charter for that. I think, therefore, the OSCE, I think really we should save the money in having this organization. Although I once negotiated their headquarter agreement with the Austrians, so it's actually a great pity. But the OSCE is really, at the end, you know, the monitoring mission couldn't succeed because the great majority of countries in the OSCE were not interested in it. I mean, how can a monitoring mission do a job on which most member states says, oh, we see that differently. It's all a Russian aggression and see it always on the one side. They didn't want these reports, so it could not succeed. And the OSCE has basically lost its ability to keep peace in Europe. And I think we could save some dollars and have some nice coffee in Paris, maybe in Vienna. Vienna
I started with a very difficult question. I'd like to finish with a difficult one as well. If you had only one brief message to your decision makers or to former decision makers, what would you send from this Peace Forum? What would you say to European Union leaders, Dr. Galacteros?
I would speak. Oh, sorry. Resign. Yeah, please resign. Do something else. Be in your garden. Look at your flowers. No. I would probably speak first to my president, to my leadership, national leadership, and say, you have a chance, you are friends. You can, if you want, if you have the courage to, you can be at the initiative of a big conference, of a different speech, completely different speech, concerning the Ukrainian war, and just starting to spread a different narrative. Stop your media, stop your mainstream medias, because they are terrible. They are making something very, very wrong for the French people first, because they're lying all day long, and of course for the peace. So stop your medias, stop lecturing the world. Stop lecturing the world. It's the same. It's what you said. It's the same for America, certainly, but certainly for the whole Western world. The rest of the world doesn't want to be lectured anymore. They don't stand it anymore. And it's also useful for Russia. So, and try to embody some security guarantees sustainable for Russia and for Ukraine, which means coming back to neutrality, abandoning the idea of NATO enlargement.
Thank you. What would be the 1 or 2 sentence message to Biden administration?
Our biggest challenges in America are domestic, not foreign. The biggest foreign problem we have is our own grand strategy, and therefore if we reshape our grand strategy and we focus on the domestic challenges, we'll be better off as a country. And our challenges are economic and cultural, and Americans need to be prioritizing those.
Thank you. The message to the African Union?
Well, again, in this world there is a home for everyone. There is ample room for all the world to really be a source to enrich this human experience, instead of disrupting multilateral responses. You know, multilateralism now is in crisis, not just because of this war in Ukraine. This crisis starts very long ago, because of this very selfish spirit sometimes we feel in how world powers ignore the expectations of the rest of the world and focus on their priorities.
Thank you. If multilateralism is in crisis, what is the message to the UN Secretary General?
That's not me.
I know, but you can send the message.
Let me just say something about Europe. Just a signing. You know, we have given on these French-German friendship thing. I think that is a huge, huge disadvantage for Europe. You know, we were able to do something in 2003 when the Iraq War was. We were able in 2008 on NATO expansion, and of course, it turned out not to be the same thing than out the Minsk agreement. There must be something in France and Germany, and I studied in France with the Français, is of course they are very different countries, but because they are so different in Europe, I think there could be a powerful sort of initiative where other countries could group around it. I don't think it will come from the European Union. To the Secretary General, I think he's a huge disappointment. I think he hasn't realized that he's a Secretary General of the UN. He still acts as if he's a Prime Minister of a NATO country. He has basically kept out of this conflict. I don't know why. That's the typical things, and I don't think that with him we will get ever anything either intelligent or otherwise engagement to help to end this war. I think we have to, he's not the person to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear panelists. We appreciate your fruitful thoughts. Thank you very much for this very interesting panel, and thank you for the audience for your attention. Thank you.